The day I buried my husband and son was the day my mother chose a Hawaiian vacation over me. While I was mourning the loss of my entire world, she was basking under the sun with my sister, their laughter echoing over white sandy beaches. That was the moment I realized, some people's love is nothing but a cruel illusion. And I was done pretending otherwise. Grace had always considered herself lucky. At 38, she had built a life filled with warmth, love, and devotion. Her husband, Mark, was her rock, the one person who could make her laugh on her worst days and comfort her through sleepless nights. They'd met a decade ago during a local charity event she'd volunteered for, handing out meals to the homeless. Mark had been there, too, quietly washing dishes with a calm efficiency and a modest smile. Their shared desire to make the world a better place had drawn them together, like two pieces of a puzzle meant to fit. Conversations had flowed effortlessly between them, and over time, those talks turned into late-night phone calls, spontaneous outings, and eventually, deep confessions that cemented their bond. Grace could still remember the day Mark had proposed, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the ring beneath the shade of the old oak tree where they'd shared countless picnics. The sincerity in his voice as he whispered, "I can't imagine a life without you, Grace. Will you marry me?" had melted her heart completely. Their life together was filled with unshakable devotion and understanding, the kind most people spent their entire lives searching for but rarely found. Their love only grew stronger when they welcomed their son, Ethan, into the world 8 years ago. The moment Grace held him in her arms, she knew that nothing else in life would ever matter as much as her family. She devoted herself wholeheartedly to being a mother, nurturing Ethan's gentle, curious spirit. Mark had been the kind of father most children could only dream of. Whether he was building elaborate Lego castles with Ethan or coaching his soccer team on weekends, he always found time to be present. Their house was often filled with laughter, the kind that felt as if it could chase away any sadness or fear. Ethan was a bright, inquisitive boy with an infectious smile and a fascination for the simplest of things. A walk in the park would often turn into an impromptu nature documentary as Ethan pointed out bugs, flowers, and birds with enthusiastic curiosity. Grace adored how Mark encouraged their son's inquisitiveness, never making him feel like his endless questions were a burden. Watching them together, her heart would swell with gratitude, feeling like she had been blessed with a life too good to be true. Despite the demanding hours of Mark's job as an architect, he made sure his family always came first. Their love was not just spoken but shown through countless gestures of kindness and sacrifice. It was a life Grace had worked hard to build, and she cherished every moment of it. However, even amid her perfect little family, there was one wound that had never fully healed, her strained relationship with her own mother. Growing up, Grace had always yearned for her mother's approval, but no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. Her mother, Julia, had remarried when Grace was just 12, and her stepfather, Ron, was a man who believed that kindness was a currency only meant for those who could return it. When her half-sister Mia was born a few years later, Julia's affection became a treasure Grace was no longer meant to receive. Instead, every ounce of love, every bit of attention was directed toward Mia. The imbalance was glaring, painfully obvious even to Grace as a teenager. Where Mia was showered with gifts, affection, and praise, Grace was given indifference, wrapped in hollow smiles and lukewarm gestures. Family dinners were a constant reminder of her place on the periphery, of how her mother's gaze would drift over her as if she were invisible. Ron made no effort to disguise his favoritism, making sure Mia's every whim was catered to while Grace's accomplishments were met with dismissive nods. In school, Grace excelled in her studies, hoping that academic success would somehow bridge the gap between her and her mother. But Julia's praises were always for Mia's mediocre achievements rather than Grace's hard-earned triumphs. Graduation came and went without celebration. Her mother had been too busy planning Mia's cheerleading competition to attend Grace's valedictorian speech. The sting of her absence had left a permanent mark, one that would shape Grace's adulthood in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. As Grace grew older, she tried to make peace with the reality of her family dynamics. She reasoned with herself, believing that if she built a life of her own, she could somehow escape the pain of being overlooked. But even as she fell in love with Mark and created a family of her own, the ache of her mother's disregard lingered in the background. Mark had been her biggest supporter when it came to dealing with Julia's dismissiveness. He'd once told her, "You've built something beautiful despite everything. That's your strength, Grace. Never let anyone take that away from you." His words had become a mantra she repeated to herself whenever the bitterness of her childhood tried to claw its way back into her heart. Yet, despite the emotional distance between her and her mother, Grace had continued to reach out, hoping against hope that one day Julia would finally see her, appreciate her, and love her for who she was. Unfortunately, that day never came. Grace's kindness and loyalty were met with entitlement and manipulation. But no matter how many times her mother disappointed her, Grace couldn't quite sever the connection. The moment Grace hung up the phone, a numbness overtook her. The casual cruelty of her mother's words echoed in her mind like a twisted melody she couldn't shut out. Her mother's voice had been cold, indifferent even, as if Grace had merely inconvenienced her with her grief. "We can't just change our plans, Grace. You have to understand, Mia needs this vacation. It's been a tough year for her." The words replayed over and over, each repetition leaving a deeper wound. The fact that her mother prioritized Mia's happiness over the funeral of her son-in-law and grandson was beyond comprehension. Grace stared at her phone, her hands trembling as her mind struggled to process the conversation. The hurt mixed violently with a fury she had never known before. What kind of mother could be so callous? What sort of person could dismiss such a devastating tragedy as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience? But what haunted her most was the realization that Julia's cruelty was not new. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of strained smiles and half-hearted gestures. Grace had spent her entire life trying to earn her mother's approval, hoping that one day Julia would see her worth. But this moment shattered any illusions she had clung to. The pain of her mother's betrayal settled deep within her chest, like a burning coal that refused to be extinguished. And even then, Grace could not fully grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. Desperation clawed at her, pulling her down into an endless chasm of grief and disbelief. There was a funeral to plan, a tragedy to mourn, but instead, she found herself obsessing over her mother's cruelty. Anger coursed through her veins, its intensity almost overwhelming. How could her own flesh and blood be so heartless? Grace's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the madness. In her darkest moments, she questioned everything. Was she truly so insignificant to her mother that even the death of her husband and son meant nothing? The agony of such a thought was unbearable. Yet, even as the rage consumed her, she could not bring herself to confront her mother directly. It would be a futile endeavor, she knew. Julia had made her choice clear, and no amount of pleading or reasoning would change her mind. Grace felt trapped, suffocated by the cruelty of a woman who was supposed to love her unconditionally. And so, with her heart broken beyond repair, Grace made a decision. She would no longer seek her mother's approval. No longer would she allow Julia's neglect and manipulation to control her life. It was time to mourn her loss, grieve her husband and son, and rebuild the shattered remains of her heart without the toxic presence of those who had failed her so completely. The day of the funeral arrived like a nightmare Grace couldn't wake from. The air was thick with the scent of roses and lilies, their sweetness clashing cruelly with the heaviness in her chest. As she stood before the twin caskets, her knees nearly buckled under the weight of her sorrow. Mark's casket was adorned with wildflowers he had always loved, their vibrant colors a painful reminder of the joy he had once brought into her life. Beside his rested Ethan's, much smaller and draped with a blue blanket, Grace had stitched herself during the early months of her pregnancy. Seeing them there, side by side, tore through her like a blade. But she couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not here. She needed to hold herself together if only for the sake of honoring their memory. As she spoke the eulogy, her voice was steady, even if her hands trembled. She spoke of love, devotion, and the countless little moments that had made their lives beautiful. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm raged. Julia's absence was like a wound that refused to heal. Her own mother had chosen a Hawaiian vacation over mourning her grandson and son-in-law. It was a betrayal so profound that Grace struggled to breathe through the pain. Friends and distant relatives filled the pews, their faces etched with sympathy and sorrow. Even Grace's estranged father had attended, his tears genuine and his embrace sincere. But Julia's absence was glaring. She and Ron were already halfway to paradise, their selfishness shielded by the illusion of family loyalty to Mia. Grace's fingers dug into her palms as she tried to suppress the rising tide of anger. How could a mother abandon her child during the darkest moment of her life? What kind of twisted loyalty could drive someone to turn their back on their own flesh and blood? As the ceremony came to a close, Grace found herself unable to look anyone in the eye. The pity she saw on their faces felt like salt in a wound that would never heal. The world had collapsed around her, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a shattered existence. And yet, through the anguish and betrayal, a seed of determination began to take root. Grace realized then that she could no longer pretend that her mother's cruelty was anything less than intentional. The truth was bitter, but it was also freeing. She no longer had to chase after a love that would never be given. The only love that mattered now was the one she held for her lost family and the strength she would need to carry on. In the weeks that followed her final conversation with Julia, Grace found herself haunted by echoes of the past. The betrayal she had endured was a wound that ran deep, and the pain of it often resurfaced when she least expected it. But each time the hurt threatened to consume her, Grace forced herself to focus on the life she was building. The seaside cottage became more than just a refuge, it was her rebirth. She transformed it from a place of loss to a sanctuary of healing, filling the rooms with the warmth of her creativity. Her paintings grew more vibrant, the sadness in them gradually giving way to hope. It was a slow process, but one that gave her purpose. Her days were no longer spent waiting for approval from a mother who had never truly loved her. Instead, Grace devoted her energy to rediscovering herself. She enrolled in online art classes, her talent blossoming under the guidance of instructors who praised her work without hesitation. It was something she hadn't experienced before, unconditional acceptance from people who saw her value without demanding anything in return. That validation, from strangers who recognized her worth, was the beginning of a healing journey Grace hadn't realized she needed. She poured her emotions onto canvas, her grief and anger blending with joy and renewal. But even as her life began to take shape, Julia's absence lingered like a shadow. The phone calls had stopped, replaced by letters of apology that arrived sporadically, each one more desperate than the last. Julia's words were laced with blame and self-pity, a toxic mixture designed to draw Grace back into her web of manipulation. But Grace saw through it now. She no longer felt compelled to answer, no longer felt the need to justify her decision. She had accepted that her mother's love was a condition Grace could never meet. And as painful as that truth was, it was also freeing. Grace's life was her own, and she would not allow Julia's cruelty to define her. The day Grace decided to cut ties with her mother for good felt like a door slamming shut on a life she no longer wished to be part of. It wasn't an easy choice. The guilt still clung to her like a parasite, whispering that she was abandoning her own blood. But Grace had spent too many years sacrificing her happiness for a mother who had only ever seen her as a source of financial support. The final letter Grace received from Julia was a tirade of bitterness, accusing her of selfishness and cruelty for daring to prioritize her own healing over their needs. But Grace had already made peace with her decision. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it away in a drawer, a final reminder of the person she once was and the woman she was becoming. Grace no longer answered the phone when her mother called. She had blocked Julia's number months ago, but still, the occasional message would find its way through. Julia's entitlement was as relentless as it was misguided. But Grace's resolve was stronger now, fortified by the clarity that came with distance. She refused to let her mother's venom seep back into her life. Instead, she focused on the things that truly mattered. Grace found joy in her art, her work gaining recognition from local galleries and online platforms. She had built something of her own, something pure and untarnished by the cruelty of others. It was a life shaped by her own hands, one that no one could ever take away from her. One day, Grace received a call from her estranged father. The man who had abandoned her years ago seemed different now, his voice trembling with genuine remorse. He had heard of Julia's actions, the unforgivable decision to prioritize a Hawaiian vacation over the funeral of Grace's husband and child. And for the first time in his life, he acknowledged his own failures as a parent. "I wasn't there for you, Grace. I know that. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try and make things right." Grace's first instinct was to reject him, to lash out at a man who had never been anything more than a ghost from her past. But something in his voice touched a part of her she had long buried. The part that still yearned for family, for acceptance. And so, with cautious hope, she agreed to meet him. Grace's father, Richard, proved to be a far cry from the man she remembered. His hair had turned silver, his posture hunched by the weight of years spent running from his own guilt. But his remorse was genuine, his apology not laced with expectation or manipulation. For the first time, Grace felt seen. Truly seen. Their conversations were awkward at first, stilted by years of estrangement and resentment. But gradually, they found common ground. Richard spoke of his regrets, his failures as a father, and the mistakes he wished he could take back. His sincerity was a balm to Grace's wounded heart. It was not a complete healing, but it was a start. As their relationship grew, Grace found herself letting go of some of the anger that had consumed her for so long. Richard's efforts to rebuild their bond were clumsy but genuine, and Grace appreciated his willingness to try. It was more than she had ever received from her mother. Richard's support became a pillar of strength Grace hadn't known she needed. They shared stories of her childhood, the good and the bad, each conversation unearthing memories that had been buried beneath layers of pain. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to feel something other than anger and grief. She allowed herself to feel hope. With her father's support and her own determination, Grace's art blossomed. Her paintings were displayed in galleries, her name gaining recognition within the community. She had found a way to turn her pain into something beautiful, something that spoke to others who had endured their own suffering. Grace's journey was not one of perfection. There were days when the grief still threatened to consume her, when the memories of Mark and Ethan felt like open wounds. But those moments no longer defined her. They were simply part of the tapestry of her life, woven into the fabric of her strength.